What is the best way to prevent chaos from occurring in society? Should it be to have the most absolute punishments possible? In this lecture video, I'm going to look at the Han Feizi. Han Feizi was a legalist, ancient Chinese philosopher, and we're going to see his argument for why the state should be strong and all-powerful in order to prevent chaos from occurring and for peace to reign supreme. So Han Feizi was born roughly 280 BCE, lived until 233 BCE, who was actually executed by an emperor who was actually a follower of his philosophy. He lived in a time where he was actually of a noble background, unlike other classical Chinese philosophers like Mengzi and so on. Han Feizi wrote the most classic treatise of the legal philosophical tradition. The legalist tradition really had its heyday during the Warring States period between 475 BCE to 221 BCE. What happened was that prior to the Warring States period in ancient China, you had the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty basically had full control over China, but it began to break down, and power went from one central place where the emperor ruled to the leaders of each of the different provinces. This led to a kind of civil war, a period of conflict lasting, roughly 2.5 centuries. It wasn't until the Qin dynasty finally, in 221, re-solidified China as one empire, ending the Warring States period, ending this period of chaos. And it was the emperor of the Qin dynasty, actually, that ended up having Han Feizi put to death by following Han Feizi's own philosophy, interestingly enough. Now, the core problem of legalism, of the philosophical school that Han Feizi was a part of, the main question of legalism is how to preserve and strengthen the state, right? It is in a direct reaction to this Warring States period. So one of the assumptions is that if persons are left free to act on their own, then chaos results. You can't have everyone just doing what they think is in their own best interest. This ends up leading to a kind of fractured social fabric. Similarly, if states have no rules to follow, if states are in conflict with one another, like as happened in this Warring States period where it had multiple states, right, vying over dominion, vying over control, then it's the same thing as if you have a bunch of people with no government just thinking for themselves, doing what they think is best. Then you just have constant chaos. And the same thing occurs when you have all these various states that exist with no rules to follow. Perpetual war follows. So who is Han Feizi writing for in order to address this question? It's the ruling class, and we should keep that in mind when we're reading the Han Feizi, because he's not trying to talk to the common person and how they should think of society. It's specifically, he's specifically talking to the ruler, to the ruling class, to try to get them to adopt his philosophy in order to stop chaos from occurring. For legalism, morality, religious beliefs, and ceremonies, these kinds of things which are so important for Confucianism, which Confucianism is going to be a direct reaction to, those things are regarded as fatuous and distracting. They're pointless. They're ridiculous. These things are distracting from real practical affairs, the affairs of how to survive and prosper in the world of the present. It doesn't matter for the legalist, upholding the ceremonies because you think it's good for, some traditional reason. It doesn't matter if you think it's upholding religious beliefs is good because that's what God wants. It doesn't matter if you think doing things for the right reason because it's the right reason alone and not because of the consequences is good. The only thing that matters is doing what is in the best consequence of the state, because it is only the state that can prevent chaos. So the sole concern for legalism is order, such that nothing is left to chance. No private judgment or appeal to privilege. So it is a very authoritarian philosophy. We first have to understand the way, or the Tao. Feizi says that the way is the origin of all, and it is the measure of right and wrong. That the way is kind of nature. It is the universe. It is the rational order of the universe. And it is nature itself that determines what is right and what is wrong. Feizi says, the way is vast and great and without form. Its power is clear and orderly and extends everywhere. The way pervades all affairs here below. Therefore, examine and obey the decrees of heaven and live and die at the right time. Compare names, differentiate events, comprehend their unity, and identify yourself with the way's true nature. So if we look out into the world, we can see there are tendencies in how things occur. We can see that there's a certain flourishing, for example, the way that plants survive in certain conditions and they don't survive in others. If they get certain nutrients and they don't get others, they do better as compared to doing worse. We can see there's a certain nature to human beings. There's a certain nature to other animals. And when all these things follow their nature, they do what they're supposed to do, they are following the way. The way is the rational order of the universe, and it is the way that informs Feizi's entire conception of how the state should best flourish in terms of preventing chaos from occurring and in terms of preserving peace, so that everyone can survive and prosper. So the way of the ruler. So 2 questions. Why should there be only one ruler? Why should the ruler be sovereign? Feizi says, as the way is sovereign, as nature, as nothing can challenge nature. Nature is all-encompassing. It has the final say, always, for what will happen. In the same way, so is the ruler. Authority should never reside in 2 places, he says. The power of decree should never be open to joint use. If authority and power are shared with others, then all manner of abuse will become rife. If law does not command respect, then all the ruler's actions will be endangered. If penalties are not enforced, then evil will never be surmounted. So why should there be only one ruler? Why can't you have maybe an oligarchy, maybe a democracy with a parliament? Because the only way that people are going to obey the law, the only way they're going to obey the state, is if there is one entity, the ruler, who has the final say, from which there is no further recourse. Think of it like this. If you get into a fight with someone else, okay, and you think you're correct in whatever happened, and the other person thinks they're correct, and there's no court, let's say, right? What's the best way to resolve this conflict? Well, you're probably going to have to fight each other. But what happens if they go get their friends and it's 5 against 1? Well, you go get your friends and now it's 5 against 5. And you still haven't determined, right, who actually was correct, who committed the crime, so to speak. Let's say there is a court, okay? You both go to court to resolve the conflict. The court sides in favor of you. But your friend or that person thinks, no, you're wrong, right? You're the one that actually did the harm, not me. That's what they think. So they go to another court. Turns out that other court rules in their favor. So now you have 2 courts that have ruled in the opposite favors of the parties involved. Who is right? How do you stop conflict from continuing? Because if that's the case, well, then you're left back to having to fight each other. The only way you can prevent conflict is to have one sole entity that has the final say. Right? I mean, this is the basic idea behind the Supreme Court in the United States, for example. You have one court that has the final say. All other courts have to follow that ruling. This is also important because what it means is that you can't just let people voluntarily agree to follow through with contracts, for example. If you had someone sign a contract and they refuse to follow through with it, who's going to enforce that contract? You can't rely on each other just because, let's say you agree. Let's say you all wanted to form a society and you say, let's come together to sign a contract that says we will submit to this government, right? What's the guarantee that you all will submit to that government if you don't have one ruler who is sovereign, one ruler who has the power to ensure other people will follow that contract? Otherwise, they will be punished. If you just leave it up to, faith, well, that's probably not going to turn out very well for you. It is not just that Feizi thinks that you should have a ruler which determines everything in an arbitrary fashion, that just because maybe today they feel good, they'll be nice to their citizens, tomorrow they'll feel bad and they'll be mean to their citizens, and they can do that because they're sovereign. Right? That's not what Feizi thinks should happen. So in this way, he's weary of tyrants, we might say. There should be public law. Right? If everyone seeks private gain, what they think is in their own self-interest, then the state is weak and chaos reigns. What you need is a public system of law, something where it's known to the citizens. If you violate these, let's say, decrees, you will be punished. If you don't, you might actually be rewarded if you follow through with what is permitted by the state. And the idea is the law should be set up in the best interest of the citizens insofar as their best interest is their own self-preservation. So the state determines what is best for the self-preservation of everyone else. Because if everyone else is left to determine what is best for their own self-preservation, well, obviously, it's better for me if I have the house of my neighbor as opposed to, my neighbor having that house because their house is nicer. Mine is kind of crap and it's falling apart. Right? See how that works? So then I might try and take it from my neighbor. And it's my neighbor's best interest to, of course, try to stop me from taking their house. You need a state, an all-powerful entity, something that has absolute control over a dominion, a territory, with a monopoly on the use of force, that says, if you try to take your neighbor's house, you will be punished. So don't do it. And it's actually in the interest of the neighbor to not have their house be taken, and it's in my interest to not be punished. And perhaps then, the state should also in some way try to make it so I have a house that isn't falling apart, or to encourage me actually to be productive and fruitful in my labors to build a better house. So Feizi says, if rewards are handed out on the basis of good report alone, and punishments on the basis of slander, then men who covet rewards and fear punishment will abandon the public interest and pursue only private schemes, banding together to further each other's interests. If you want to prevent the citizens from banding together for their own private interests and forming cliques, you need a rational, consistent, and impartial standard by which people are going to be governed. If you have a tyrant who is able to just arbitrarily decide what the law is, who's going to be punished, who's not going to be punished, people aren't going to respect that tyrant. They're going to think, that tyrant's not doing what is in my best interest. So you need a public law, again, that is rational, consistent, and impartial, such that you don't even know the ruler is behind the setting up of that law, because it's not the ruler that you hear when the law determines who has violated it or not. In this way, if we want to ask, how can the ruler most effectively govern as the sovereign? Feizi says, as the way is unseen, as we do not see some person or some one entity that kind of flows through nature, making sure that nature runs effectively. Nature is everywhere. It's in everything. There is no one source of nature. In the same way, so should the ruler be. As the way is unseen, so is the ruler. If the state is set up to run by itself, and the ruler is not perceived by its citizens, then the state becomes sublime. It becomes something that people are in awe of because it is so massive. He says, the way lies in what cannot be seen, its function in what cannot be known. Be empty, still, and idle, and from your place of darkness observe the defects of others. See, but do not appear to see. Listen, but do not seem to listen. Know, but do not let it be known that you know. The idea is, if the ruler is never perceived, then there is no one person that people can channel their anger at if they are upset with their situation. If there's no one person they can channel their anger at, then the power of the ruler is increased. Because now people don't know whether to be mad at certain magistrates or someone else. So the kind of anger is fractured. But additionally, if you have the state that just seems like it's running like a machine, then it can be consistent in its application of the law. Then it can be better suited to carry out the law. Because if you have one ruler that's in charge of actually implementing the law in every particular situation, it's just impossible. No one is wise enough to know exactly how the law should be implemented in the province of Qin as compared to the province of Zhu, for example. So you need magistrates who are best able to do that, but where, of course, they ultimately answer to the ruler, but it doesn't seem like the ruler is actually telling the magistrates what to do, because the ruler is not. Right? In this way, the ruler is guided by a principle that is impartial, that is rational, that seeks to set up the government such that it doesn't matter what particular individual is in that role, because the role that they serve is fully defined. The ruler, if they act only according to the way, and they never reveal their personal desire, will maintain the strength of the state. If the ruler lets known what their desires are, what they like and what they don't like, then what's going to happen is all their ministers, all their magistrates will end up doing things that they think is going to please the ruler. They're going to end up playing to certain characteristics that the ruler subconsciously or unconsciously is going to end up falling for. And when their personal desire is revealed in that way, then the ministers and the magistrates start dividing up the power of the ruler, and the ruler no longer becomes sovereign. So the ruler should be like a wheel where the center is empty, and it seems as if it's just turning on its own. Now, this is actually an idea that comes from Taoism. But here, legalism is actually transforming this idea of a state being set up to rule on its own, such that the state is all-powerful, as opposed to the state being more anarchic, as Taoism argues. Just as the way is the origin of all things, and so the way determines how things flourish and how they do not. Similarly, Feizi argues that persons and government have an ability to flourish when they do what they are naturally predisposed to do. That every person has a certain natural capacity to be a laborer, to perhaps be a craftsman as opposed to a fisherman, to be a political ruler as opposed to maybe a cleric. In the same way that a cheetah is meant to hunt using their speed, whereas an eagle is meant to hunt using their eyesight. He says, things have their proper place, talents their proper use. When all are in their proper place, then superior and inferior may be free from action. Let the cock herald the dawn, let the cat catch rats. When each exercises his ability, the ruler need do nothing. If the ruler tries to excel, then nothing will go right. If he boasts of an eye for the abilities of others, he will invite deceit among his subordinates. If he is lenient and fond of sparing lives, his subordinates will impose upon his kind of nature. If superior and inferior try to change roles, the state will never be ordered. So it is up to the ruler to set up the state, to structure society such that everyone, every citizen, performs the task that they are best suited to. When they do that, society will flourish, everyone will prosper, and there will be peace and security. Now, this is actually very similar to what is known as natural law theory. Natural law theory is the idea that there's a kind of natural law such that the role of government is to best mimic that natural law, to actually implement it, to enforce it, to put it into practice. Now, usually it's admitted that the state can't do this perfectly because human beings are flawed. But again, the idea, in the same way, as Feizi keeps saying, is for the state and the ruler to be as close to the way, the Tao, as possible. When they do so, they become like nature, where they seemingly have no source, where the wheels are set in motion and cannot be stopped, and where everything does exactly what it is supposed to do. Now, Feizi does list certain things that the ruler, the sovereign, should look out for. He says there are 5 ways the sovereign can be corrupted. When the ministers shut out their ruler, when the ministers get control of the wealth and resources of the state, when the ministers are free to issue orders as they please, when the ministers do righteous deeds in their own name, when the ministers are able to build up their own cliques. He says, if the ministers shut out the ruler, then he loses the effectiveness of his position. So if they don't do as he says, if they don't allow him to use his power as he's meant to, then he has lost all of his practical, effective power as a ruler. If they control wealth and resources, he loses the means of dispensing bounty to others. He's no longer able to actually use the power of the state. The power requires wealth, right? Human beings do not just do anything of their own accord. Typically, you have to pay them. Now, this feeds into this idea of legalism, that human nature is actually bad. It is bad in the sense that everyone is self-interested. For that, the state wants to play into it to some extent, insofar as, right, you want to use the wealth and resources of the state. But you do so such that you cancel out everyone's self-interest by saying the only interest that is going to be preserved is the interest of the state. It's the only way to effectively quell this bad human nature. Furthermore, if they issue orders, Feizi says, as they please, he loses the means of command, right? If the ministers start issuing their own orders, then this idea that the ruler is not seen really becomes true in the sense that they're literally no longer the ruler, and other people are going to start following the decrees of the ministers and not the ruler. He says, if they are able to carry out righteous deeds in their own name, he loses his claim to enlightenment. Suddenly they become the spokesperson for the state and not the ruler. And if they can build up cliques of their own, he loses supporters. He no longer has full control over the domain of the state. If there are, let's say, like, for example, parties, political parties in a state. All these are rights that should be exercised by the ruler alone. Legalism was famous for being extremely harsh. In fact, legalism did not survive long after the Qin dynasty had solidified its rule over all of China. And the reason is people actually became very tired of the intense punishments that legalism argued the state should use in order to solidify its rule. Feizi says that there are two handles of government, right? Two handles in the sense there are two things the government can do to preserve peace. Use punishment and favor. So how do you ultimately enforce the law and power of the state? It is actually mostly through punishment, not favor. And in fact, the penalties should be heavy. He says, for putting fear into the officials, awing the people, wiping out wantonness and sloth, and preventing lies and deception, nothing can compare to penalties. If penalties are heavy, men will be honored and their rights will not be invaded. If they are honored and their rights inviolable, then the ruler will be strong and will hold fast to what is essential. Hence, the former kings held laws in high esteem and handed them down to posterity. Were the rule of men to discard law and follow his private whim, then all distinction between high and low would cease to exist. So in the same way that the state should be sublime in terms of the sense that it should be all-encompassing, right, where someone just gazes at the vastness of it, its power should be the same, such that if someone violates law, penalty should be heavy. Penalty should be such that perhaps you might not want to be imprisoned for 10 years for stealing a loaf of bread. You might not want to be put to death for stealing a loaf of bread as well, right? Perhaps you get put in prison for 10 years, you do it again, you get put to death. Those are very high penalties for merely stealing one loaf of bread. And yet the idea behind this is, if people know that this is the penalty, well, it's obviously not rational to steal the loaf of bread. It's rational to not be put to death. This approach to government is very similar to what Niccolo Machiavelli had argued. So famously, Machiavelli asked the question, is it better to be feared or loved? And he said, it is better to be feared. Machiavelli argued it's better to be feared for the reason that when a ruler is loved, people begin to think that they are above the law. They begin to think that they have a special connection with the sovereign, with the prince. And when that's the case, suddenly the power of the prince starts to fade away. Similarly, for Feizi, the government is best preserving its strength if it is feared. Because when it is feared, the idea is if people are really self-interested, they will see it is in their both self-interest to not violate the law. Now again, as I mentioned, there was actually a reaction and an abandoning of this legalist philosophy after the Warring States period had ended. That people actually ended up not being able to tolerate such extreme punishments. That being said, I still think the question is worth asking. Even if we might want to say this idea that punishments should be heavy perhaps is too extreme, are there other ideas that Feizi has argued for that are still worth listening to today?